So Tanner, when we started this podcast over a year ago, I don't even remember now, a year and a half almost probably. What was the most stressful or complicated thing from your perspective in starting our podcast?
Figuring out what people would actually want to listen to. Because
Mm-hmm.
when we started out, we had kind of an idea, but we quickly just started talking about anything and everything that was on our mind. And that has a certain amount of validity to it, I suppose. But ultimately, I'm sure the regular listeners would come in one week and we'd be talking about AI. The next time we'd be talking about some random thing that happened to us the week. And then we would interview somebody and then we would go back into some other thing. And we just didn't have the level of thoroughness and vision in some aspects, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
that you may need to, actually grow an audience and build a podcast.
Absolutely. So we were talking earlier, and I brought up the concept that several people have come up to you and I and complimented our podcast, which is very nice. But we also get a lot of comments, or questions like, "How do I start a podcast?" or "I could never do that," or anything like that. We get a lot of compliments about podcasting in general, and we are not a podcast, if that makes sense. We're a small business entrepreneurship podcast. But the questions we're getting are coming from entrepreneurs who see the value in a podcast in terms of developing their online presence and maybe even marketing and sales. And there's other benefits to a podcast. But people, I think, are pretty intimidated by it. So I wanted to discuss today. We're between interviews. It's been a while since we've had that. We've had some amazing interviews recently, but with this week of a bit more slowdown, I wanted to maybe, instead of taking the role of always sharing other people's knowledge, we share our own knowledge, and not about my personal career or your career, but in what you and I do every week, and talk about podcasting specifically in terms of how to do it, how to get going, and some of the benefits, whether you do it for fun or you're doing it for your own small business or whatever the situation is.
From the outside, it seems daunting
Mm-hmm.
and somewhat insurmountable, right? Where it's like, okay, I have to get all these things, I have to spend all this money, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time and effort and energy, and I'm going to have to be so well researched. And I say, no one's going to want to listen to me and everybody's going to judge me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that. It's really, really easy and simple to start a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really excited that you came up with this idea, Wyatt. I think it's a wonderful thing. And like you said, so many people have reached out and have been just so gracious in saying that they love listening to the podcast. And they're like, man, I wish I could do one.
Mm-hmm.
So here's an extra kick in the rear end. So let's get you going.
Yeah. I always say that everyone has a business idea, but I'm starting to think everyone has a podcast idea too.
And the great novel that's sitting, just a
Oh,
few
yeah.
pages
Everyone
deep.
has a novel, a business idea, and a podcast just waiting to come out.
Yeah, acoustic guitar in the corner that they only know a couple chords.
Okay, now you're just judging me, Tanner. And I also want to add that I thought about this. I think starting a podcast is very easy. I think maintaining a podcast is a little complicated. And I think making a successful podcast is hard. So there's like easy, medium, and hard levels to podcasting. Fortunately, the easiest thing you can do is start one. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start chronologically, Tanner. I am Mr. Joe Smith, and I decided I have a small business and I really think a podcast is going to help me. But holy cow, I don't know editing. I don't own a microphone unless it's attached to my computer or phone. Where do I start, Tanner? Step one. I want to start a podcast. Where should we go next? Where should we start to kind of develop that idea in our head?
Yeah. So the first thing comes down to the actual things that you want to say, the content, the show itself, because it's so easy to get trapped in I'm going to buy the equipment. I'm finally going to dive in and I'm going to spend all this money. And a lot of times if you don't have the actual like meat to back it up, those boxes are just going to sit in the corner of your office and not actually become anything. So
Mm-hmm.
before you spend any money and before you do those things, spend some time with yourself or with your friends on what you want to talk about and what you think that people would actually find value in listening to. That is one of the biggest things. And I have a brother-in-law who loves like retro cartoons. And so I've been helping him with his podcast, which was called Let's Watch Cartoons, but he's rebranding it to being like building a better Saturday morning. So we all
Hmm.
have the childhood remembrance of waking up Saturday morning, getting your cereal, and just watching cartoons. And then as an adult, you can feel quite nostalgic about that. So going and finding what cartoons are actually worth as an adult to invest your time in and discuss those and do things. That's a fun and exciting idea that resonates with people because there's something genuine and something exciting about it. If you're just talking about the same thing that everybody else is talking about, like, hey, I'm going to give my take on current events, and I'm nobody who's actually has any sort of collateral social knowing, it's just randomly spouting their opinions, no one's going to really want to listen to those things. So the first thing is just coming up with a good idea that resonates with people.
And then next, you kind of need to figure out your format. Is it going to be you yourself talking into a microphone? Is it going to be you yourself talking into a microphone with a camera in your face? These things right here. Is it going to be interviews or some sort of hybrid, similar to our podcast, where it's individual episodes plus interviews? Um, there's so many different formats. Is it going to be a storytelling format? Is it going to be educational? What is your niche, your industry, whatever you want to do? Saturday morning cartoons, I would have never imagined starting a podcast like that, but the idea, I think, is really good. It's solid, it's unique, and not a not like two yahoos from Nebraska being like, let's start an entrepreneurship podcast. But no, there's so many different ways you can approach a podcast, and I think that's what one of the big perks is. You don't have to be on video, you don't have to be on YouTube. We do audio visual for our podcast because we were comfortable with it, and we saw there would be potential benefits of getting our face attached to our voice, but that is not a requirement. So understanding your topic and kind of your angle to make yourself unique. That was a really good example of, I want to talk about current events, but no one in the world would want to hear Wyatt, Carson from Omaha, Nebraska, talk about current events, because who the hell is Wyatt? My own family wouldn't listen to that well, to be fair, my family doesn't listen to this podcast, but you know what I mean. um, if you just got to make sure you're either passionate or knowledgeable about your topic, and if not, maybe your podcast kind of shtick is, I don't know anything, and I'm going to go talk to people who do, and that's a fun way to
Mhm.
angle it. So you've got to have your topic, your niche, and then your format. How are you going to record and do this podcast? What are you going to do on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever basis?
And you can evolve that over time. So you can start it off just being you. You can try some interviews and you can do those things and you'll find your rhythm with it. The biggest part is just getting started.
Mhm.
And so once you have that idea, you want to get going. So I guess that kind of leads us into the next part naturally, which is what equipment are you going to need?
Absolutely. So let's talk hardware first. So I was trying to think of this, and there's a million different software. There's a million different hardware. Podcasting has blown up in terms of a hobby or even a business for a lot of people. So you can't go to a Walmart now without seeing podcast setups, right? For me, for example, I'll talk about this. So I've got this boom arm, a microphone, little pop shield. I think this entire microphone setup, the mic, the stand, the pop filter with these headphones costs me about 120 bucks. I think is about what I spent for this setup. My camera, it's a 4K high def camera. I think I spent like 40 bucks on Amazon for it. It's just a USB webcam. I've used it for meetings at work and then turned around and use it for podcasting. So, assuming you have a computer, my setup of my microphone, my stand, and my camera, all in, all the hardware I possibly could use for this, and we'll talk about switches and stuff in a minute, but bare bones, if you want to do a video and audio, probably around 150 bucks for me. But that's not even the low end, definitely not the high end. Low end, a lot of people start off recording on their phones, right?
I would say the biggest thing to get when you do want to get started and you're going to take it somewhat seriously is invest in a decent microphone. Like you said, they don't have to be expensive. I used a Blue Yeti for a long time. You can pick those up at Walmart for I think between $60 and $100 or something, depending on sales and availability. You don't have to go spend $400 or $500 on a professional microphone and then all of the cables and attachments and all of those things because it's diminishing returns ultimately on what you're going to get out of it. Mostly because again, it comes down to the level of content quality more than audio quality, but people are not going to stick around if the audio is terrible. And so investing in a good microphone, they'll be gracious on cameras, they'll be gracious on the other things. So doing that is your number one. You were saying you use a 4K webcam. I literally just connect my iPhone to my MacBook and it gives me really nice looking video,
Hmm.
which which is fantastic and I don't have to spend any extra money because I already have an iPhone. There's a lot of tools and resources that you might already have without having to go out and spend the money. And there's a million lists on YouTube and all these places of what's the best microphone, what's the best boom arm, what are those things. Again, I wouldn't stress too much about those components. I would again focus on what you have and
Hmm.
then just the essentials that you need to get going at the beginning.
Spot on. Don't go out and buy a $500 mic. It's not going to make your podcast better. Will you have great audio quality? Yeah, but you're still going to be a very green newbie podcaster. And that $500 microphone's not going to give you an audience. It will help your audio quality. That's it. Now, you need to be able to not be scratchy and,
Hmm.
horrible quality, but it doesn't have to be high fidelity, crazy, amazing stuff either. It can get better. You and I joke all the time. If you go back and look at our very first episode of this podcast, oh my gosh, I was like sitting in front of like a messy corner of my office. I don't even know what microphone I had at the time. I didn't have this camera. It was rough. The first few are rough, and I think that's something people need to learn to accept. Also, is I agree with you wholeheartedly. Start out with what you have. Start out simple. Try and put a lamp in front of your face if you don't have a ring light or these lights over here. Uh, there's you don't have to have the whole setup. You just need to get started. And people will dawdle for weeks and months, very similar to starting a business, before they actually record their very first anything of them talking because they're like, oh, I've got to get this and I've got to get this and that. Everything has to be perfect. Nothing has to be perfect. You just have to have electricity, really.
And again, going back to I have almost exactly the same equipment that I had when we got started, and and it looks substantially different just because I know how to use stuff. So, like behind me, the purple light is just a random Amazon RGB light that I've had. It's the same white cinder block walls that look like prison if the lights aren't in there very well. I finally just this episode upgraded my microphone for a
Mm-hmm.
while, but mostly because I just wanted something on a boom arm that wasn't constantly on my desk. Before all the podcasts before this was literally a stack of about 10 books with a microphone propped on top of it, sitting here with my iPhone and a couple cheap lights, and it looks professional. And so again, you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to spend a lot of money on really high end stuff, but as you start to learn your rhythm, you can start just going piece by piece. So again, you get yourself, you start getting your flow, you start then you can upgrade your cameras a little bit, you can upgrade your lights. I used to use just a clearance black sheet that was from Hobby Lobby. I think Wyatt has not much behind him
Pretty
different right
similar.
now.
Yeah.
Yep, just very basic. So there's not some huge expensive case that we're in. It's not high end production, and there are podcasts that do that, but those are few and far between. But they're also probably hundreds of episodes in, and they got their content dialed in. So that's when they're wanting to invest. So I know we're kind of stressing this point over and over again and going a little bit in circles, but just get started. That's the biggest
Just
thing we can
record
say.
something.
Mhm.
Absolutely. You can fix it, delete it later, improve upon it, whatever, but just record something. So speaking of recording something, moving into the software world, there's really two things you need, two pieces of software or systems that you need. The first one is a recorder, And then the second one is an RSS feed. So let's talk about recording first. So, for example, Tanner and I, since we started this podcast, have used a service called Riverside. Riverside is a fantastic platform. It's not perfect, but we really have been enjoying it. And even over the last year and a half or so, we have seen upgrades and new improvements that they're consistently adding. Um, I'll speak for myself. I personally enjoy Riverside because it gives a very professional feel for interviews. It's one of my biggest things I enjoy about Riverside. You send out your Riverside link and they come in as a guest, and Tanner and I are here on the screen, and we have buttons that can control, our interviewers' audio inputs and gain levels and all of these things. It gives us really full control, while the experience for the interviewee is very professional, very clean cut, and looks nice. And for the most part, we have relatively few issues. The biggest issue with Riverside is bandwidth. If your interviewer, for example, has rough bandwidth, they're doing it on their phone in 4G, 5G, or something like that. It can be a little slow and a little rough on that one. But for the most part, I think Riverside has been very good to us. Tanner, would you agree, disagree? What are your thoughts on Riverside? And then I'll talk about a few of the other options.
It's essentially just Zoom, but for podcasting. So that's how I describe it for most people. So really, you just come in, you hit record, you have a conversation, just like you would just join a Zoom call and have a meeting, or have a just a random call with a person. So there's very little friction coming into just understanding what the basics are. Like you said, there's a deeper layer that you can get into, and you can customize a lot of the sound levels and do all those little pieces. But for the most part, it's pretty plug and play. So getting it in there, hitting the record button, and then from that, getting a formatted audio and video that is actually high quality that you can use into later post processing tools, or you can use their built in post processing to publish different types of content, helps substantially. I mean, I would say the platforms that we've chosen have really enabled us to become consistent with this because of the little amount of friction it takes to actually get going.
Yeah, that's a great point. While Riverside can look really nice and give us that professional feel we want from our guests, it's not a crazy complicated software. We had it figured out by the end of our very first recording. Um, there are settings and things unique to it that you kind of have to learn, especially when you get into the editing features. But it is very plug and play. It's easy to mute yourself. It's easy to hit record. It's easy to stop. It's easy to invite people in. Yeah, it's been good to us. Now, Riverside and other podcast recording software out there like Descript and Squadcast, there's several others, are paid services. There is a monthly subscription, and there are usually tiers giving you extra features the more money you pay, blah, 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 blah. That's to be expected. But once again, to go back to our hardware discussion, you don't need this stuff. You don't need Riverside. You don't need Squadcast, and you don't need anything else that you have to pay for to start, at least. There are, for both Apple and Windows computers, free options to record. So one of the most common things people record podcasts on around the world is GarageBand. I don't own an Apple. We were just talking about this, Tanner, but I'm aware what GarageBand is, and I'm a little jealous I don't have access to it. It seems to be a pretty well-rounded, easy-to-use software. And then on the flip side, and I think you can get this for Apple too, but on PCs, there's Audacity. Now, Audacity is a audio-only software, so if you have an audio video podcast, it makes things a little more complicated. But Audacity is a fantastic recorder as well as audio editor. I have it on my computer. I've used Audacity for lots of different projects and things. And then finally, my third and final recommendation is Zoom. Zoom is easy. Everyone has access to Zoom. You don't even need the premium version of Zoom to record your meetings. There's a time limit, I think, associated to the the freemium version of Zoom. But every person with Google Chrome installed or whatever can access Zoom and begin recording themselves both visually and audio as well. So there are free options. Once again, if you have a cell phone and an internet connection, you can make a podcast.
Yeah, so that's the recording portion, and you started touching on like the post processing.
Mm-hmm.
So from that, you have your different platforms like Audacity or Riverside that you're able to take and chop up, do your audio level balances, and make sure that everything
Mhm.
is packaged really nicely. I use the Adobe Creative Suite, which is something that's probably a little bit farther out of reach for a lot of people just due to the complexity of it.
Mhm.
That's I've been using it for years and years. So we'll take our high quality audio and video and export it from Riverside. And it actually has an export to Premiere function, so it gets everything packaged ready. And then I'll do all of my video and audio editing in there and export it. So that's one component that we do for this podcast and have from really the early stages. I think I started using it maybe in like episode 20, but before that we just literally hit the export full episode feature within Riverside and just put that on the internet.
Mhm.
But that was one of the first like step up the ladder in terms of our production quality that we've done, and it's something that you can do too
Mhm.
if you want to start investing in those and learning those tools. And even within that, I'm just scratching the surface of it. And I actually use a lot of plugins. There's some really neat AI technology automation extensions that I use, like Autopod, which will do all the chopping back and forth for me on who's talking and do all the cuts
Mhm.
and stuff. So I don't mainly have to do it myself. And they can also do, it has a little jump cut editor that'll take out all the little gaps of blank noise or space, so it flows a lot quicker and we don't have a lot of dead air, so that it has a much better pace to the podcast. All of those
Mhm.
little things are extra flourishes and stuff that you can do as you want to step up your game.
Absolutely. And yeah, and to preface, I mean, Tanner has Premiere Pro because Tanner is a very talented and experienced digital artist. So he has these expensive softwares already at his fingertips. If you gave me Premiere and installed it on my computer and paid for the crazy expensive subscription, I would probably uninstall it because it is complicated. It's a strong learning curve. That's an advanced level. There's free options in lots of these systems. That the only thing that you will need to do beyond that, if you don't have audio or visual editing experience, spend some time on YouTube. How do I audit? How do I edit a podcast? Search that in YouTube. You'll have 1 million results to dig through and just learn. If you're using Audacity, for example, completely free, relatively simple software to learn, there's a million different things on YouTube that will show you how to do exactly what you need and make it sound really good. You do have to do post editing though.
Yeah, well, and a lot of these platforms like Riverside, the AI functionality of it is getting substantially better. So they will actually they just came out with a feature called Magic Audio, which will do a lot of your audio cleanup for you. Their editing tool will automatically do the cuts and stuff similar to like what I do in Premiere based off of who's talking. You can do, it looks like a Word document in the text editor, and you can automatically have it
Oh
take
yeah.
out the dead air. You can take out words you don't like. You can kind of cut and chop it up just all via your browser, which is really good. So again, there's the learning curve and the friction and stuff on a lot of these platforms that are specifically designed for use cases have really enabled the novice to become a lot more professional, and the professional to do things a lot quicker for a lot cheaper than they would have had to do traditionally. Because again, you could spend days potentially editing a podcast or a video and chopping everything and making it perfect.
Oh
And
yeah.
in our process, we've really distilled it down to just a few hours a week, which is much needed so we can actually be consistent with it all.
The next and final piece is an RSS feed,
Yep,
which
publishing. Yep.
yeah, which is publishing, which is
Mm.
I have a fully edited podcast episode. I need to put it out to the world. How do I get it on Spotify? How do I get it on Apple, Google Podcasts? Um, iHeartRadio even has one. What are some of the other services that we
There's like
connect to? And almost every RSS
Stitcher,
feed,
Amazon has
Stitcher.
one with
Hmm.
Audible.
Yep.
There's a lot. There's dozens, I think, of different
Yeah.
platforms you can get into.
And if you use a relatively common RSS feed, this is one place you're probably going to have to spend some money to pay for a monthly subscription in an RSS feed. So, another example, Tanner and I for decentralized opportunity, we utilize Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is probably one of the biggest, most well-known, most widely used RSS feeds to house podcasts. It creates kind of a mini website for you, holds all of your episodes. It automatically archives them, but allows you to pull them back. Analytics attached, and essentially what it is if you're not familiar with an RSS feed, this is going to be your Explain It Like I'm Five version. It's a website where you upload your audio and or visual files, and it just creates a catalog for you, and then it pushes it out to all of these podcast services. Once again, the Amazons, the Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You connect your RSS feed to these websites, and they are able to read every single time you upload a new podcast episode, and they'll automatically update it like, hey, new decentralized opportunity podcast just dropped 0.5 seconds after I hit, send or approve. This is your tool to get it out to the world. And my strong suggestion for those of you who are considering or looking into this, sign up for every service. The iHeartRadios, the Apples, the Spotify's. Apple is by far and away still to this day the most popular choice for people to listen to podcasts around the world. Definitely get into Apple, which conveniently is also the most complicated to get attached. It's not hard, it just takes longer. There was like a week or two kind of like trial period before they allowed us to be on Apple. Everyone else was, just accepted our RSS feed instantly. It costs nothing to get onto these services like Apple or Spotify. You just have to do the work within your RSS feed.
And the other part, if you are doing video, you want to make sure you have a good place to upload there. So we do YouTube, which it's free to sign up. You have your YouTube studio, you can get things going and build your channel and do stuff that way. They also started their own podcast functionality within YouTube, so you can kind of connect it in through your studio there. We've been exploring some other platforms as well. Twitter, you can do video, but you have to have a paid account if you want the longer than a certain length or certain size. But I know that they're starting to get more popular around for long form content. There's some other places that also are starting to get a little bit more traction here and there. But for video, as it stands right now, it's YouTube. But you're fighting the algorithm. You're playing a different game with that. So don't expect substantial results. I'm just excited when we get viewers on YouTube, but the audio only. I mean, I think that is probably the great majority of the way people consume podcasts these days. So, don't worry if you don't want to be on camera. Don't worry if you just want to just have the audio only, because I think that's where the majority of your audience will be anyway.
Yeah, and yeah, you've got to remember that what is podcasts obviously very popular. Lots of people listen to them. But think about yourself. How do you listen to a podcast? Are you loading it up on your phone and then continuing to stare at the screen of the podcast website? No. You press play and you set it down, or you plug in your earbud and you go do something else. Audio only podcasts, in my opinion, are probably still king. There are extreme benefits to having video though, and that's kind of going to be my segue into this next and final section of this, which is going to be what else which is going to be the marketing, the not customer, but audience engagement, these other things that need to happen in order for you to progress. Um, Anyone can make a podcast, but it's hard to make it popular. It's hard to make it successful. And this other section is what makes them popular and successful. So let's talk about that, Tanner. What do you believe non-software, we already have the premise, we have it recorded, it's edited, it's wonderful, it's in a beautiful RSS feed attached to all the services. You hit submit, and now you have a live podcast. Are you good then? Do you never have to do anything again?
No, well, clearly not.
Obviously.
Yeah. It all comes back to your network and your community. So whatever you make, whatever, if medium, anything like that, you people need to see it. And there's some misnomer that like, oh, if I just publish it, the algorithms are going to pick it up and show it to everybody, and I will just blow up out of nowhere from obscurity and get millions of views. And it doesn't work that way.
No.
Not at all. I mean, there might be the lottery winning odds of that potentially happening, but the reality of it is you're going to start with your friends and family, and you're going to be posting to your social network places, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just saying like, hey, we're starting a podcast. And the people who know you and the people who like you will probably check in. And so your first episode you'll probably get a decent amount of downloads because it's new, people are curious, and they just like to see what you're up to. It's when you consistently start publishing them that you're really going to see how much value people are getting from it, because then they're going to actually be coming back and listening to those pieces. So you want to hook them with something good, but you want to keep keep that quality up and keeping the value. And from that, you're going to start getting some word of mouth, and you're going to start getting some retention. And you're going to start getting some natural discovery. And the algorithm's going to see like, hey, there's actually people coming and clicking and spending time on this. So maybe I'll push it out a little bit more. I think Mr. Beast has a quote saying like, don't think of it as like the algorithm pushing it out. It's like thinking about like how much of your audience actually wants to listen to or view this. So the algorithm is really a representation of the audience. So if what you're doing, no one knows you, it's kind of mediocre, no audience is going to invest their resources, which is their time, into viewing this. So it's naturally just going to go nowhere. But again, if you can slowly build up, you can slowly do those pieces, it's just going to compound over time. And that's going to what generates just more and more traction with your podcast. And it's self-validating a little bit more. And that gets you more connections, and that gets you better guests, or all of those little pieces too.
Mm-hmm.
And
it is the I apologize.
Yep. Oh no, I was just going to say there's unnatural ways of doing it, and we can maybe discuss some of those and some of the challenges in places. But I think being authentic with it and just leveraging your own networks to start is really a good place.
Yeah, and I apologize. What I was going to say is it's very similar to starting a small business.
Mm-hmm.
You start your own at-home business, whatever it is. Where do you go? Do you just like create your product and service and then become instantly rich? You tell your friends and family. 23, Tanner. 23. I remember this number for some silly reason. It was the number of views our first episode got in the first week. We got 23 views. And I'm pretty sure it was mostly from like your family and my mom.
Yeah.
Oh, and that reminds me, before I change subjects, I promised I would do this. We have a mega fan, Tanner.
Ooh,
yes.
awesome.
So I apologize to completely disrupt the flow of this, but I want to make sure I get this out here because I promised I would do this. So we have a mega fan of the decentralized opportunity, and his name is Brock. And Brock, bless his heart, is this cool dude. He's a kid. He goes to elementary school with my kiddos, and he lives right across the street from us. And you've probably heard me talk about it a couple times. We have a very tight-knit neighborhood. We're all friends. We eat dinner together, and we, have garage beers all the time. We're a tight neighborhood. So I know Brock really well. I've hung out with him a lot. But I found out that Brock has listened to every single one of our episodes from start to end. And I don't know if we have a single person out in the world who's done that but Brock. So Brock, if you're hearing this, man, we appreciate you. We are actually in the near future going to be developing some decentralized opportunity swag, some stickers and stuff like that. So, bud, I got you covered. We'll get you loaded up on that. But I digress, Tanner. Thank you for letting me go on that tangent. What I wanted to say was the additional pieces of it is there's a few things, and you hit on it. You have to iterate. Your first episode will not be the same as your 67th or 68th episode, and it shouldn't be. If you are 5-10 episodes deep and you're not breaking more than like 10, 15, 20 views, it's probably not your consumer's fault. There's something you probably need to change. And for example, I've said for example a lot during this podcast, but I feel like we made so many mistakes we've learned from it. An hour-long podcast, give or take certain circumstances, is too long. The first 50 episodes of this podcast were an hour plus long. And they were wonderful. And really, I think we put a lot of effort into those and a lot of knowledge for people. But not everyone likes to sit down and listen to an hour-long podcast. So, we have consistently tried to take feedback from our audience, and through the analytics of Buzzsprout and our social media accounts, and try and shift things. And that's what you need to do if you're starting your own podcast, is just learn and iterate. Do not expect to be a world famous podcast in your first 10 episodes. You just need to learn to get better and better and slowly see that subscriber count rise.
And don't get discouraged. I mean, so much of the process that we've done is almost therapeutic. I mean, it's been a learning discovery and a personal development portion. If you just look at the numbers, you start to just believe that they're the only thing that matters. And it's not about that. It's about the quality of the conversation, or the level of the exploration, or what you can share, or how you can connect with others. There's so many more important things than just how many downloads you get and how many views you have. And so that's one of the big things that I can really recommend to everybody is, again, find your what does a podcast really do to serve for you, unless it is an avenue in which you want to become some sort of like internet famous. But that's a bad thing to kind of to go at, because you're definitely going to get disappointed, and it's
Yeah.
probably a tail you don't really want to catch.
I had to go grab the sticky note. It's right next to my work desk, Tanner, because I wrote it down.
Mhm.
Goodhart's Law. I think you've talked
Yep.
about it the last 2 episodes, so we're going to talk about it for a third. It's Goodhart's Law says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. I can think of at least 4 to 5 times Tanner and I have sat down and had a conversation outside of recording, just talking about the podcast, and we talk about goals. And every single time we've sat down to talk about goals, we leave without having goals. Because exactly what Tanner said is we realized that a year and a half ago, if we had set a subscriber count like goal, we would have been disappointed. And if you're disappointed, your initiative to continue will drop significantly. Let's say, for example, when we first started, we said we wanted to have 250 downloads an episode. And after 20, 30 episodes, we still didn't have that count. We do now, but 20, 30 episodes in, we didn't. We would have been like, obviously, this isn't working. We should probably just quit. And we would have never gotten here. And we would have never had the amazing interviews and connections that we've and people we've met by just sticking with it. Which really leads me to my final point, and then I'll let you wrap up with any of your insights, Tanner, because I feel you do a lot for this podcast. My final point is keep going. I think we've talked about it before. Like 90% of podcasts end within before they get to 5 episodes, right? Something like that. Um, to be at 60, almost 70 episodes like we are, it's not because we're awesome. It's just because we really enjoy doing it. And sometimes after we stop hitting record, Tanner and I will just sit here and talk for an extra 30, 45, 60 minutes about anything because we're friends and we also have this podcast to discuss. But find a way to hold yourself accountable. Keep showing up. If it's a weekly podcast, show up every week. Keep doing it. If it's monthly, whatever the situation is, just don't stop because you're not finding success. So many times in this kind of hobby or business, if that's the path you're taking with podcasting, the next inflection point is just around the corner. But it's really easy to drop it and just say it's not working.
Actually, this is our 70th podcast episode.
70th, exactly. Oh,
Yeah,
this is a
so
good
it's
episode for 70. Good.
pretty fantastic. And just going back to the numbers thing, there's so many intangibles with it too. So it's not just about the number of people who download the podcast, but it's also what other forms of content you can generate from the podcast that you've recorded. So we make shorts, we have social media posts, we have images, we have quotes, we have all sorts of little mini audio snippets. And all of those get put online to connect with people, and they see them and they resonate with them. So even though like a main, like, oh, my audio downloads are down this time, your message and your visibility and all those things just are constantly spread out everywhere, and you're just visible. And from that, there's so many opportunities that can come from it. I mean, the whole podcast is called Decentralized Opportunity. So it's all about finding opportunities regardless of where you are. And the biggest thing to help enable you to have opportunity is putting yourself out there and getting people to see you and know you and recognize you and trust you and believe in you. And I can't believe how much, just from consistently doing the podcast, how many doors it's opened for Wyatt and me, how many relationships it's helped develop, friendships, colleagues, work opportunities, all sorts of collaborations, and really, really neat things that we would have never had if we were just kind of talking about doing a podcast. So again, it's not about just the views, it's not just about the downloads, it's not about whatever validation. It's really about creating something that you find valuable and that others find valuable. And from that, all sorts of unique collisions and opportunities and things can happen from that you cannot possibly preemptively understand.
Very well said. Very well said. Well, with that note, for those of you who have stayed till the end of the episode, we greatly appreciate you. If you are thinking of starting a podcast and you have questions, want to bounce ideas, reach out to us on social media, our Facebook, our LinkedIn. Um, you can reach out to us anytime. And I, I can even speak for Tanner on this one. I know both Tanner and I would love to speak with any of you and give you our advice. Neither of us are social media experts. So if you want social media marketing, You might be best served elsewhere. I won't speak for Tanner on that one, but don't ask me about marketing advice. But we can tell you our experience, and all I can tell you is we're 70 episodes in, and I I don't see any reason why we won't make it to 140. You know, um, it's something that has become a passion and really enjoyable for us. So reach out to us if you have any questions or comments. We will gladly speak to all of you and just give us our give you our 2 cents. Um, Other than that, if you enjoyed this, if you felt like you gained something from this, even some motivation to just start, um, like, share and subscribe this video or podcast. Let other people know. If you know someone who's talked about starting a podcast but never did, maybe send them this video, send them this podcast. You know, we would appreciate it. And who knows, you might find someone who really resonates with this and jumps out and creates the next Serial or Joe Rogan Experience, or I'm trying to think of other really popular podcasts right now, but I'm running out of ideas.
Yeah.
Either way, thank you so much to our audience. We greatly appreciate you. Please like, share, and subscribe this podcast, and we greatly appreciate all of you. And we'll see you next week.
Yep. We'll see you next week, everybody. Bye.